Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to this clinic, and thank you very much for the invitation from the SLD who are organizing our clinic for the NFR this year. Great innovation to move things online, to adapt as we've been going through the situation that we've been dealing with over the last 2 years. And many of us have taken advantage of that. Just before I get into the formal part of the slides, I just wanted to say the target audience for this session is clearly, in my mind, people who are like me, either new to operations or are planning a layout and wondering should they or could they consider adding operations to that layout, and what would it mean in terms of planning the layout itself. And I think then finally, there are lots of people that I've been meeting across the province who have layouts that they built, much like my very first one, because they wanted to build a layout, but didn't really have operations in mind when they did that. And I would think that some of what I'll be talking about here in terms of planning and organizing would fit for people who are wondering, well, could I add that dimension to my existing layout? For people who have been in operations for a long time, I've been meeting men across the province, some of whom have been doing formal operating on a variety of layouts for probably 20 or more years. This particular presentation will seem pretty elementary. Please bear in mind then my target audience are people who are just getting into it or considering getting into it. So as I thought about what I wanted to cover, I looked at three different components. One is the planning of what is involved and how we might go about setting up a layout to have an operational component. Another portion of my presentation, a shorter part, will deal with how to manage it on our layouts. And then finally, at the end, I'll take some time to share with you a couple of examples of how we could run an operating session on our layout, even one that's of modest size. Those of you who went through or attended Tim Heyman's presentation before this one, Tim set me up very nicely with some really great examples. He talked about the importance of planning, in part to make sure that things run smoothly, but to also provide interest. And he certainly showed some great examples that Malcolm also referred to at the end of how you can have an operating session even on a small layout. Mine, however, is of a moderate size. So why an operations layout, and what does it mean to me? Well, my first layout, which was started in 1989, was very much an around the room train layout. I think I had 1 yard in an urban setting, and the rest of it was wide open terrain. And the room was 12 feet by 11 feet. As I thought during my time away from the hobby about what my next one might be like, it suddenly dawned on me one day that more than just watching it and building it, I could actually engage with my layout with something that I realized operations could offer me. And with that comes a social aspect. Now, we've obviously been challenged in that regard in the last 2 years, but that's really the exception to the rule. What I've been enjoying before that, and I'm really looking forward to getting back into later this year, are the opportunities to work with others. Learning is something that is a passion of mine. I'm reminded of a phrase from years ago. You don't want to get in a rut, because one way of thinking of a rut is it's a coffin with the ends knocked out. So one of the aspects of getting into operations, which again, I knew nothing about when I first had this idea, was all the things that I've been exposed to over the last 5 to 7 years. And the one thing that certainly came to mind as I thought about this presentation, and I say this to many others who may be like I was, considering whether they want to have an operational component or dimension to their layout, is the realization, or the discovery actually, that running an operating session and being engaged in an operating session is really a different kind of a puzzle. Think of it almost like, if you're a Star Trek fan, the three-dimensional chess matches that they sometimes have. Think of, or is that Star Wars where I've seen it? But regardless, you've got moving pieces, you've got things coming in and out of the area that you're working in, and you've got pieces of equipment to move around in a simulated model railroad space. And things are just never staying the same. And it really can stimulate the brain just as much as Wordle or Sudoku or some of the other more popular paper-based challenges and puzzles that are out there. So operations to me has been a lot of fun. This is one of the last operating sessions at the very beginning of 2020. Roy in the foreground is operating Fisher Yard, which you'll see in larger context in a moment, and Steve is working Stelco, or part of Stelco, in the background. What I also realized is that operation has given me another opportunity to mimic the real world. In my case, I'm a prototype modeler, so this is a picture of what was called the acid train, and I'm able to duplicate that on my layout as a result of working this into my operating sessions. I'm just going to try to remove view that's been blocking some of the text on the slides for me. Okay, I'm up and running. So what do I mean by a moderate size layout? Well, we can quibble over a definition, and that's not an area I want to get into. But essentially, it seemed to me that anything between 100 to 250 square feet in HO scale, which is what I model, probably fits in what we would consider, generally speaking, to be a moderate or mid-size layout. So small and large are on either side of that. And Tim, again, in his presentation before mine, gave you a great example of how you can do a lot in a little amount of space and include operations as a part of that. So thank you, Tim, for that setup. As I thought about what I've done and what I would share with you today, it seemed to me that there's this kind of a constellation. It's not really a process of like 1, 2, 3, but what are the things that you might want to consider, keep in mind as you're getting ready to both plan your layout, track plan, or make changes to an existing one if you've already started into it. How do you get from A to Z if you ultimately want to be able to operate on your layout even before it's built and finished? So in my case, choosing the railroad was easy. Starting back in the 1980s, one of my sons said he would like to model the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railway because our family hailed from the Niagara Peninsula. Initially, we included the Welland subdivision, and later in my current layout, we added the Dunnville subdivision. But many of you may be freelance modelers. So there's still, I think, lots of tips and ideas in terms of how you might research or go about getting the information that you need that you can take away from today's presentation. And in my current layout, as I'll show you in a moment with the map of the area, I've added in the CN line from Welland to Port Colborne. So if you're not familiar with it, this is the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railway line in sort of this thick black. If I can get my pointer up, here we are. And this is how it was originally chartered in the 1890s. I model the Welland subdivision, and then to that I added, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Dunnville sub, which allows me to access Port Maitland down at Lake Erie. And I also added in green, the CN line from Welland down to Port Colborne. If you were to come to the room, stand at the pocket door, looking in over the duck under for the upper deck, this is what you would see. And I'll walk you around really quickly. I don't have a completed up-to-date, unfortunately, as CAD drawing. I abandoned that once I got into making modifications and I need to update it. So very, very quickly, obviously, a 2-deck layout, 62 inches from the floor for the upper deck. The lower is 42. Geographically, working around the room, dimensionally, 22 feet from front to back. And here at the widest point in the room where most of the track is, it's about 8 feet wide. Over here on the left is a jut out in the basement foundation. And in here, there's a 48-inch wide, 3.5 turn helix. It is accessed through this incline that you see on the lower deck, which is a stand-in for a track right-of-way that goes up the face of the Niagara Escarpment in Hamilton. So the tracks come into sort of the midpoint on what would be the full height of the helix, and then make their way up and out onto the upper deck at the Y that in fact used to be in Smithville. Smithville is just off the camera scene here to the left, and there's an industry there. Welland, Ontario starts roughly here with a pipe factory, a Union Carbide, Atlas Steel in the distance. Then very much sort of out of the geographic flow, if you were to look at a map, is Port Maitland in the back corner, and the large fertilizer chemical industry that used to exist there, IMC Airco. Here on the right in the upper deck is Quill Yard in Welland, and here you'll see just a little portal through the wall. Management gave me permission to put a staging yard in the adjacent room, and in the corner off to the right on the upper deck is Robin Hood Mill, which exists in a different ownership, under different ownership in Port Colborne. On the lower deck here on the left is a very large 4 feet by 5 foot Stelco installation, and you'll say, well, it's awfully dark. Part of the reason why the fascia is missing is we're in the process of installing 24-volt LED lighting, which will illuminate the lower deck and get rid of the shadows caused by the upper deck fascia. So Stelco is here. There's an industrial belt line that runs down the back wall and services, in addition to National Steel Car, a number of other industries down here, and the Forest Street container facility. Fisher Yard is a major feature of the Beltline and services a wide range of industries to this day in the dock lowland area of Hamilton, North Hamilton. Over in the back, continuing with Hamilton, is a Westinghouse Plant 3 and the Procter & Gamble facility. And then this very large 9-track facility here is Kinnear Yard. Just tucked into a small island here will be American Can, and then in the foreground on the lower deck is the Chatham Street Yard, which was the engine operating facility. I don't have, or I should say maintenance facility. I don't have space for the turntable that had been there and the roundhouse, but we will have the coaling tower, which in the 1970s, the era that I model, was repurposed for fueling and sanding of diesel locomotives. So that's a quick run through of the room. And as you can see, not a lot of open space. In fact, very, very different from my first layout, which was probably 2/3 to 3/4 open space scenery. Here, I've packed in as much operating capability with lots of customers as I possibly can. There's no right or wrong. This is the way I chose to go. I wanted lots of activity and lots of variety. And let's see how I got there. And you could obviously do this differently. If I had a much bigger room, I would indeed stretch this out. I wouldn't just keep packing more in. The one consideration that one wants to bear in mind is what are you going to be running in terms of engines, and the planning of this, and we'll see the scheduling in a moment, are really important in terms of the number of trains you're going to have, how much power and how large the consists are going to be, and how many of these might be working concurrently given the number of operators that you might have in the way your schedule is set up, because that's going to ultimately affect your power plan for your layout as you're constructing it. One of the things I like is variety. And one of the things I realized the more I did research, by the way, my original layout in the 80s and 90s was set in the 1950s, what is commonly called by most modelers and publications, the transition era. But I realized that the 70s in many respects is a transition era as well. One is the change from first generation to second generation locomotive power. The era of mergers had started in the United States, and rule changes, much to my surprise, I discovered about 3 years ago for the first time that rule changes, for example, meant that cars on interchange service had to have their roof walks removed. And I think the implementation date for that was officially in the late 1970s. Can't recall the date off the top of my head. So lots of change during this period as well. So lots of variety. So how do you set up a schedule for operating a model railroad like a prototype or your freelance, so it had aspects of the real thing? Well, in my case, I'm lucky because I'm modeling an existing, or what was an existing prototype railroad, now fallen flag, the TH&B. There's great books such as this one. At train shows, you can obtain timetables, and I would imagine that something like this would be equally helpful for someone who is freelancing. If you take a look at the table of contents for this particular schedule, you get an idea of just the range of information that they provide, everything from mileage distances to speed restrictions, and of course a timetable and rules of operation. I'm also a member of the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Historical Society, and I'm also involved in their publication. And where you can find historical societies associated with the prototype railroad that you are modeling, they're just a wealth of information. Every issue of their publication, for example, has this train consist support, and this highlighted area on the right gives an example of the kinds of load information that it contains in a lot of cases. So I've been able to answer the question, what was servicing this industry, what was in this yard, and what were they carrying? Who were they going to and where were they coming from? Very, very nicely, thanks to this kind of information. The next thing, of course, you want to have an idea of what kind of traffic existed on the railroad at some point in time that you're modeling. And this is the kind of information that I've been able to glean both from the In the Shadow Giants book, but also from just other research online and talking to people. One of the aspects that you see down on the very bottom bullet, that because this is a transition era, as I call it, in the 70s, you have increasingly larger and different rolling stock appearing on railroads. So you now have 50-foot and longer, extremely heavy hoppers and other specialty cars that are moving very, very large freight. And the bulk of the fleets, certainly up through the middle of the 1970s, and in the case of the TH&B, till its ultimate absorption into CP in 1987, the appearance of larger and larger consists was needed. I have got great photographs of at least 5 engine CP and TH&B consists moving through Hamilton and at other locations on the route during the 1970s and the 1980s, until much larger power was made available. So this gives you an idea of just the number of opportunities for having switching activities and operations, and engaging people to actually run an operating session on my layout. One of the tips that Ron Tuff has given me, and that's been one of the great aspects of being a member of the NMRA, is I wanted to learn more. The network of people that have introduced me to operations, like John Wagner and Paul Shantz, but also Ron Tuff and a variety of other people, their sharing of information and tips is another wonderful resource. So taking the time to develop a string diagram like this helps you to avoid the sort of thing that Tim was talking about in his presentation. You don't want to have boring sessions, but you also don't want to have conflicts where two trains are trying to get into the same space at the same time, or one that's trying to do a piece of work is still waiting for the delivery of one that should have been its predecessor in the schedule for the day. So creating a visual map of what it is that you need to get done at a particular location on your layout is time well spent. It's helped me a lot as I moved on in the planning process. So we've run through railroad roster schedule. Let's go on with this constellation of elements in the planning to industries, loads, and rolling stock. So again, need to do research to understand what might have been, because in a lot of cases, depending on the decade that you're modeling, businesses don't still exist. And in some cases, the buildings themselves are completely gone. working with a prototype that has lots of documented information has been very helpful. One that you shouldn't forget about is public libraries. Much to my surprise, given I live at least 2 hours away from Welland, Ontario, is that the Welland Public Library, has placed their photo library online for easy access. The Hamilton has done somewhat the same. So thanks to the internet and public institutions and others, getting information onto the internet is just in itself a wealth of information. Here's what I've discovered over time. The obvious industry in Hamilton, Stelco, has been supplemented by all sorts of other locations and facilities that created traffic for the railroads. Just as recently as 2 weeks ago, I was reminded that Smithville had this company, Grefco. So my research in many respects is ongoing. Again, just the marvel of the internet. There I was, 7 years ago or so, working outside of Canada, about 50,000 kilometers from home. I had some spare time on a weekend, thought I would do some more research into what I knew then as ERCO, but had no pictures of whatsoever. One thing led to another. I discovered the Port Dover, which was across the river, or is across the river, I should say, from Port Maitland on Lake Erie. Port Dover has a historical group. Found the name of one particular individual by the name of Bill Warnock. Sent him an email. 4 hours later, he sent me this and a couple of other photographs, only ones I've ever seen of this plant. Lots of reports, lots of information provided by the TH&B Historical Society, but not a lot of pictures of the actual customer. So I've decided I'm going to be modeling these two aspects. They're going to be up against the wall because of limited real estate in my layout, but will be a good stand-in for the facility that had been there. Another one that I was unaware of until a number of years ago, my wife, who hails from the Niagara Peninsula, said, well, why don't I consider putting the Robin Hood flour mill into one open corner of the layout? Had never heard of the industry. One thing led to another, and Lance Brown, the archivist at the TH&B Historical Society, confirmed that indeed the TH&B had running rights on the CN line and was able to surface it. So voila, I worked over about a 4-year period, and I'm still working to incorporate this scene into the layout, and it is provides lots of interesting operational problem solving. Another industry that I kind of knew about, Atlas Steel, no longer in its old form, but still existing as a small steel producer in Welland, Ontario. Ironically, more than a decade ago, was holidaying with my wife in Cuba, met a couple, and it turned out that the husband had been a lifelong employee of Atlas Steel. So he's been able to help me decipher the incredible collection of buildings. The upper image is generated, as you can see here, from Google 3D graphic view, a wonderful resource that's available free of charge. It converts any satellite image. If you have a structure in the picture, you can convert it to this simulated graphic representation of the buildings using artificial intelligence. As I looked later on at this picture of the mock-ups that I've been putting onto my layout on the upper deck, I realized that I've changed this track plan. Bill has been able to help me decipher all these nondescript buildings, so I now understand what they are and which ones I wanted to maintain. The shipping shed appears probably close to a third to a half of a kilometer away from the basic oxygen furnace, but was a component I knew I needed to have. The material sorting shed works hand in glove with the basic oxygen furnace, and the scrapyard in the real world extends for probably about another quarter kilometer easy to the north of the furnace, but because of limited real estate, I'll just have it located adjacent. Well, where we've got industries, we've got loads, and of course that's what the railroad is going to make its money with. So that is the essence of operating, is what are we going to be delivering to and shipping away from all these industries. Well, one of the cool things about the Niagara Peninsula in its heyday, still before that very significant recession we had in 80-81, it was still a major industry hub in Canada. That's the Niagara Peninsula. And so the THNB was at the center of all that activity. So just look at the range of materials that were needed by these particular industries. As I researched Procter & Gamble, and I've since met a couple of individuals retired from P&G who've been able to help me understand a bit more. Just Googling, what are the inputs required to make detergent? And this is just, you'll notice the et cetera at the end. This is just some of the major components that are needed by that industry in order to make Tide and any number of other products. Again, lots of other inputs in very high volume. The American can plant was receiving boxcars of tin plate daily from Indiana. I think it was going through something like 80 rolls of tin plate a day at its peak of activity. And of course, anyone who's ever looked at the steel industry know the huge volumes of raw material that are inputted to make a ton of finished steel. All of this traffic means specialized equipment and other equipment, and that again has been sort of a happy circumstance. Again, through being an NMRA member of the International Division, which is not that far from where I'm currently living, just west of Kitchener-Waterloo. They will have periodic clinics in the Hamilton area, and their focus, not surprisingly, in part is on the THNB. As well as Stelco. So here's an example of a specialty car that Stelco uses or used to use in its Hilton works. So speaking then of Stelco, these are just some of the kinds of cars that you would want to have on your layout if you had this kind of an integrated steel mill. And Stelco was very much that. So if you've never seen one before, this is a sometimes called a bottle car, sometimes called a torpedo. But it's a hot metal car that runs from the blast furnace over to the basic oxygen, and is an interesting car in its own right. This is a specialty car that was constructed by staff at Stelco. They called it a reindeer car. And for those that are really observant rail fans, you may notice the trucks under this. It turns out that these were built out of the frames and trucks of coal tenders that were brought in to be cut into scrap. Stelco realized that they could repurpose them, and thus gave rise to this rather specialized flat car. The Flour and Columbia Chemicals industries require very specialized hoppers, I discovered. Anyone who's wondered where all the breakfast cereal went when they open up a box and discover that there's all this air at the top know how transportation of an object in a closed space causes it to settle out over time. And it becomes a real problem and a challenge if you're trying to ship something that's very finely ground, like concrete, cement, or cornstarch, or in this case, flour. So the innovators in the rail industry came up with cars like this, the Air Slide, which uses special internal compartments and air pressure, and the air pressurized, pressure-aided hopper cars with this piping that you'll see just along the bottom were developed to service those kinds of customers. This is another industry. If you'd asked me 5 years ago what carbon black was, I would not have had a clue. But just through a series of happy circumstances, I discovered that this was an industry that actually had a manufacturing facility in Hamilton starting in the 1960s, Columbia Chemicals, and that it used a very specialized form of customized hopper car. So this is a hopper car, although it looks like a very large boxcar. You'll see perhaps on your screen this slope sheet weld mark down here. And in this enclosed area on the right and left hand side of these cars is equipment for blowing in air, but also for inflating bladders, which squeeze the material out. Carbon black, I should say, is a soot-like product. It's not soot, but soot-like product. So if you think of soot that you've seen in campfires or from a gas stove that's improperly ignited or not with getting enough oxygen, you see these wispy strands. So trying to capture that and load it and ship it from manufacturer to customers has always been a major challenge. The car that you're looking at here is the rail industry's innovation for being able to capture some of that business. So lots of hatches across the top, because something this light and wispy that is static charge can't be dumped in easily in an open area without it flying out the top. And the discharge ports were specially designed. They actually mate with special ports between the rails in the customer's facility. So all in all, a very interesting, innovative industry that, in my case, I can capture on my layout. And again, moving on through the list of industries, they all require slightly different and in some cases specialized rolling stock in order to handle what they ship or receive. The other thing that I began to discover as I did more research starting probably about 4 years ago was there was lots of opportunity suddenly for interlocation shipping throughout the layout, both on the lower and the upper deck. An example is Grefco. Grefco makes fire brick. It's a fairly large factory in a small town called Smithville on the Niagara Escarpment at the upper level. And it shipped its fire brick, of course, to Stelco. I'm still trying to determine if Atlas in the old days did receive from there as well. Again, thanks to an international division presentation, I discovered that Columbia Chemicals was shipping to Union Carbide, which was using it to make large industrial electrodes. And that continued through to the 1980s. Stelco as well, of course, has a huge amount of interplant movement between the various mills and the furnaces for making steel and iron. Just lots and lots of activity. I think in one of our last operating sessions before the pandemic, we had one person probably working for about an hour and a half just on the Stelco switching jobs. So we've spent some time talking about planning it. How do you manage this kind of an operation? And then we'll finish off looking at a couple of switching puzzles. Well, there's two basic ways that I've discovered for managing an operation. The one that's the most popular that I first was using when I went as a guest to other people's layouts is the card system, and then there's the computerized approach. I chose to go the computerized way, not just because I like a challenge, but I was finding that the card system was leaving me with an awful lot of paperwork and things that I had to manage and handle as I was trying to move cars around. It is free, and I love things that are free that work. And there's lots of excellent bells and whistles. There's a good good online support group, an excellent manual, some 300 odd pages. And there's a few people around through NMRA X Speed down in Texas, and closer to home, Ron Tuff in Stony Creek have been excellent resources helping me work out some of the nuances of using the JMRI. So you can choreograph the movement of your trains and their cars in and out of a customer using this computerized system. It's really, really slick. This is one of the key inputs that are needed. So this gives you a list of your various sites, and you indicate in the system just how much track space you've got, and you can limit the kind of rolling stock that can go to each one of these areas. And you can do that on a track by track basis, and even right down to the doors on the side of a particular customer if you've got that kind of a setup. You also, of course, need an inventory of all your rolling stock. That's an ongoing process. One of the nice benefits of this feature is that when you're setting up a specific operating session, you can do a sort using the location and then place, using this as a pick list, the rolling stock that you need where you want it. And then finally, you get this kind of a manifest printout. Here you can see one of the operators has been using this. So pickups and setouts are identified, and then it's up to the conductor or the operator conductor to determine in what sequence he's going to make things work. We use, rather than all the sort of the deck of card system, we use small clipboards that I got from one of the stationery stores. And to each one of these, at each of the stations, I tape a series of schematics to help operators determine what tracks are being referred to in the manifest. So let's take an example of a couple of switch lists and just give you a flavor for what can be done on the layout. And there's another aspect of this as well, and that is that you can use these switch lists or shunting puzzles also as just an offline stimulation, brain activity way of engaging your hobby when you're not on the layout as well. So Robin Hood Mill, I've made reference to that. It is a major facility. So I'm just, for those of you who've never perhaps taken the time or even seen a shunting or switching puzzle, this is one of the resources that you would need, or bits of information you would need. So here we have the stand-in for the CN line coming into Port Colborne. The boxes with white numbers in them are giving you the capacity for the individual tracks. And the white circles with black numbers are the track numbers that'll be referred to in the train manifest if we were to run this through JMRI. I've also provided a code for the cards that will appear on the puzzle itself. So there's grain hoppers, empty and loaded, coming in, and then flour hoppers, as we saw a moment ago in the rolling stock section. Specialized hoppers are needed for the finished product coming out. You'll note at the bottom that this normally wouldn't appear, but this is programmed into JMRI on the service shed tracks here, 1 and 2. There are restrictions on what can be placed on those tracks. So it becomes impossible, if you're following the manifest, to place the wrong car in the wrong place. And here on track 2, which is the unloading facility for grain coming in, I've scratch built an unloading facility in the track work. So what we would normally see if you're looking at a switching puzzle or a shunting puzzle, as they call it in England. And by the way, if you're like me and you're very, very new to this, there are some great resources on the internet. So if you were to Google a switching puzzle, or you include the British term shunting, shunting, shunting puzzle, you would see just a wide range of things that come up. One of the main resources that you'll find are some of the great puzzles that have been developed in the past. 2 of them are the Time Saver by a very significant modeler from the past, John Allen, and another one out of England is called the Inglewood Siding. But there's lots of others. There's even one website I've discovered where there's a series of puzzles of varying degrees of increasing difficulty, and they actually you can interact with them online. So the kind of thing that we're going to do here and that you would do in the train room using your mind, the manifest, and the cars that are on the layout, you can actually play with on a computer as a way of, filling in time, challenging your brain, and quite frankly, practicing for operating sessions. So this is the beginning state. This is a TH&B switcher that's going to pick up this string of hoppers. The red again are grain, and grain is arriving, so they're loaded. These are empty hoppers specialized for flour, and you can see the demarcation and the coding that I've added down here just to help out. So this is the placement of cars on the various sidings as you and I would have come to this in an operating session on the layout. So here's what it's going to look like if you were to physically see this, just to kind of help you with space. So here's the CN switcher coming off of the main line onto the CN sub and to Port Colborne with a string of 3 hoppers. It's going to set out an interchange. And again, TH&B has running rights on this track, which is right along the back wall here. And we'll pick these up and deliver them to the customer. And there's the switcher arriving now. It's bringing in 1 hopper from Coil Yard in Welland. And if you look at the bottom, you'll just see some specialty equipment underneath. This is an air slide. And over here, the Procore hopper, you'll see this air line running along this side. And if we were to flip this 180 degrees, you'll see that there's a lot more piping on the other. And there's another challenge in operating. Some cars, like the Procore car, have to be oriented in a special way, since the customer has equipment that has to be connected to the piping to inject the air. So that's a challenge that the prototypes have as well, and we can simulate that on our layouts. Here are the 3 waiting cars. This is the outbound, and the inbound line is behind. And here you just see a corner of the scratch building I've been doing on the silo. And this is a kit, can't recall where all the components came from, to simulate the transformer that's at one end of the grain silos. And a close-up of the shed. This is obviously a mock-up in foam core, and I'd started a mock-up for the mill building, which is adjacent to the silos. And the Yardmaster's train shack is here as well. So again, this is the beginning state, as you and I might find it on the layout, or in this case, in the puzzle. So these are the inbound. These are the existing cars that have to be moved, and in some cases removed. So what creates the puzzle is getting the train that's leaving to have the cars that it should have. And in this case, this particular one, and I'll just go back for a moment so you can see this car, when it leaves on the string, has to be at the back, because it's going to be dropped at the interchange point for that CN switcher to pick up later in the day. And then here, again, I'll go back to the beginning state. A loaded car that's waiting on the inbound track needs to get down to track 2, and out of the consist will be an empty hopper left to be loaded with flour, and then a series of other hoppers. These 2 we know are grain because we've coded them in red. In the case of the manifest, you'd have the name of the copper and obviously the hopper, and you'd have the road number to identify them. And so that's the nature of the puzzle. We could fill in the gap in between. In the real world, where you and I would be operating on my layout, we would do the work that would fill this in. I've worked this through a couple of times on paper. I've never actually put one quite this complicated together yet, but we have programmed it into JMRI, and in about 11 moves, the switcher can make these changes. And why is that number of some significance? Well, I'm sure there are some experienced people out there who are quickly looking at this and saying, well, I could do that in fewer moves. And that's important because railroads are a business. The more moves I make, the more time I end up spending at that customer is time that I'm going to be delayed getting to other customers. And of course, all those moves mean I'm using fuel. So if I can use less fuel, I'm more efficient and I can save the railroad money, more profit at the end of the day. So that's the takeaway. I've noticed that I'm coming up to about 45 minutes in the presentation. I'm going to quickly show you one more and then we'll wrap it up in case there are any questions that have come in. So that was the end state. Atlas Steel, again on the upper deck, this view of the basic oxygen furnace. So this is the layout of what I've been able to fit into the space available for Atlas Steel. Again, the numbers in the white circles are the track numbers. The scrap yard, unnamed off to the side, other than scrap. The reason that this is grayed out as opposed to black, such as the other squares, is these are just temporary set outs. This track would normally be kept clear, but for moves, this is just to let you know that you could park temporarily up to 4 cars along this line. And then these are the three buildings: shipping materials and the basic oxygen furnace, 1 car times 2 for one each of the lines going into that building, with scrap going in on this line and iron, steel coming out on this, usually in the form of ingots. So a beginning state, and you just get an idea. I've provided an explanation. Again, normally this would just be on the manifest. We would have numbers, road names of the cars. You would be able to see what was in place, and the internal move would be set up for you in terms of the instructions on the manifest. How you would do it is the fun of the game, as they say. In the 1970s, the internal moves have been done by switchers that Atlas Steel had. However, for the time being, I don't have that switcher, so I'm choosing to have the TH&B switcher do it all. And that, in fact, is the situation as it exists today. There's a short line railroad called Trillium, and they not only look after the deliveries of raw materials and the deliveries away from Atlas Steel, but they also handle all the in-track moves. So the setup I have at the moment is not that far removed from what is feasible. So here you can see the location of hoppers. This one is empty, has to come out and come back to the scrap yard. This one is in second sort. And the way things worked is cars like this one coming in full of scrap from any number of locations in Canada or even upper state New York, wherever Atlas could purchase them, would come into the yard. They'd be offloaded, sorted by the crew into piles, and then reloaded into internal plant hoppers. So down here at the index, the first sort, second sort, and empty mill gondolas are all of Atlas Steel ownership, in and out. These are interchange cars coming in from, again, any number of road names and any number of locations, certainly across Ontario, if not northern US. The little squares here are the buggy cars that are used by the mill to transport the ingots. And they'd be brought over to the shipping, stripped, and then loaded in, once cooled, loaded into gondolas for shipping out. AD is referring to the arrival departure track. Again, when I have an internal switcher and TH&B just servicing the plant, TH&B would come in and simply drop off and pick up from the AD track, arrival departure track. And there's the end state. And I'll just flip back and forth again so you can get a sense of how things moved around. So one of the swaps that you may see is that the loaded gondola from the shipping has been removed and ultimately added to the consist here. That creates space for the previously loaded buggy or ingot hopper to, ingot buggy to move up to shipping. The scrap car from the yard that's full of first sort has come up to materials where it'll go through a second sort, and then a basic oxygen furnace has a load ready to charge the furnace, and an empty buggy waiting for a pour. So again, lots of dimension, lots of challenge, moving things around, moving things to where they need to be with as few moves as possible. And again, I can do this in about 10 moves right now, using this track number 2 for temporary parking on a number of occasions, as well as track number 4. And there's the switcher that is on order. That was used in the late 60s and 1970s at Atlas Steel. So to save time, I'm going to just move through American Can's, another facility that provides lots of interesting switching. Again, discovered thanks to the Ontarian TH&B publication that the scrap tin from the American Can plant was shipped over to an intermediary company in the Hamilton Dock area, called Metal and Thermit, and they detinned the scrap and then sent it on to Stelco. So again, an opportunity for other interplan plant activity. And you'll notice here there are doors demarcated along the side. This is the original plant, which by the 1970s, in fact, had been sold by American Can. I've chosen Modeler's Liberty to Modeler's License, I guess, to keep this. And it received shipments and outputs on both sides, as you can see here. This is today the CN track. Back then it was a Grand Trunk, and then TH&B came in the opposite side of the plant. In my world, TH&B is going to service both. So that's it for me. Bit of a segue from me to the next presenter. In the foreground of this scene is a mini prints, a model, hand painted. This is out of the Birdwatcher series, but seemed quite appropriate for a rail fan to accompany the chap that he's out on a nice weekend morning to pick up the action in Coal Yard in Welland. So I'll turn things over to any questions that anyone has.
Hello. Slight pause because I'm the only one here and the dog wanted to go outside. I had to run downstairs. That was excellent.
I hope he didn't pee on your leg.
No. There's a few comments for you in chat. First, were the track diagrams generated in JMRI?
No, those are manual just for this presentation.
Okay. Someone asked a similar question about the schematics. And great presentation. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. And thanks so much, Paul. Very good presentation, inspiring. I'm also modeling the Welland sub. That's from Joe Malone, maybe, in NFR Welland area. And so I had a couple of questions for you. How long is, or how big a crew do you foresee, and how long would an operating session take?
In terms of length of operating session, I'll take my lead from other people's layouts, probably a maximum of 3 hours. And that generally is what we've been doing to date. In terms of how many people, if I was running single crews, I have 4 different stations around the layout, and again, lots of industry. But in some cases, I think I might start trying 2-person crews, so 1 operator and 1 conductor. That may make things go a lot more smoothly, particularly in terms of all the switch alignment and problem solving. So in that case, it would double up to 8.
Bernard asks, was it hard to get set up in JMRI?
It is its own challenge. It's easy to start. The learning and the fun and the challenge comes from choreographing the movements. It's all doable. It's just a question, like most things to do with software, is taking your time. And if you can find someone who's been there before you, who can answer questions, that's really, really helpful. But I personally, I find it a great resource. And again, I don't mind using card cards and other people's layouts, but I do find all the paperwork challenging. And I've noticed as I watch my coworkers, how they handle it, inevitably people seem to be spreading everything out in front of them on the layout. And because I use every square inch, because I've got such a small one, there's track right up to the fascia. So now what do? Now you're holding your controller, you're looking at your manifest, and you're looking at all your car cards. And if you've got a 15-car train, you're holding a lot of car pockets. So yeah, everything's a trade-off. I'm making it work with the help of friends.
Okay. So Normand asked, do your operators switch at realistic speed? Given some operators like to bang cars around quite a bit.
Well, it sounds like a bit of a comment in addition to a question. I think at the end of the day, it's about skill. So far, the people that have been operating, some of whom don't have a layout of their own, has really been quite realistic. We're doing the best we can. We haven't had anybody go off the end of the flat earth. So that's the good news.
Yeah, that's good. So I noticed like you have an issue with compressing these large industries, and part of the solution to that is kind of, it looks like building flats or partial buildings. What's your plan about integrating them into the background? Will you use photo backdrops of those industry areas or what?
Not sure. Been thinking that through. Partly it's a budget issue. Photo backdrops have to be of good quality, and they have to be realistic. I've taken a lot of photos of the areas while rail fanning, partly with that view in mind. So I may try a bit of photoshopping to see just if I'm pleased with the results. And there's a great debate, even in the RPM groups. There's some people that talk about, the very point that you've made. They've talked about, I forget the proper term from the world of art, but the vanishing point, having dimension and everything scale back into the distance. In other cases, there are some really good modelers that have shown examples over the last 2 years in the Hindsight 2020 group of having backdrops that are kind of nondescript. I guess at the end of the day, it'll come down to budget, time, and skill.
Yeah, there was a fellow who spoke to us probably the first year of the pandemic. I think it's Robert Clark. He's from the UK. He'd done some work for Model Railroad Hobbyist, written some articles, and he's got some really good ideas about how you make realistic depth in a very small space.
Yes.
And he doesn't have a huge layout either.
Some of us just aren't that artistic. Some of us just aren't that artistic.
No, he is artistic.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I know. I think of Steve Juranics, who has a packaging graphic arts background. Bernard, our next presenter, has a marvelous art background. Those people really stand out. I'd rather not do something than do it badly. So photographic might work, but again, jury's out. We'll see.
Okay. Rick Cooper from 7th Division asked, could you state again how the schematics were drawn?
Oh, the schematics that I drew initially, just so that they're on the clipboards, are done using Word.
Okay.
The graphic feature in Word.
Okay.